Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I am also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find this podcast informative, share it with your friends, rate us, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, I'm in conversation with Professor Juan Cole and Professor Mojtaba Mahdavi about the historical and political context leading to the war of aggression against Iran by Israel and the United States. Juan Cole is Richard P. Mitchell Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan, and Mojtaba Mahdavi is a professor of political science and the ECMC Chair in Islamic Studies at the University of Alberta, Canada. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States unilaterally attacked the sovereign state of Iran, without providing any credible evidence of an imminent threat from Iran or obtaining a United Nations Security Council resolution. Irrespective of one's views about the Iranian government and political system, Israel and the United States' military actions constitute an illegal war of aggression in violation of the United Nations Charter Article 2 and a crime against international peace under international law. Now, the war is costing U.S. taxpayers approximately $1 billion per day. President Trump did not seek authorization to start this war from Congress, and oil prices have skyrocketed across the world. And so although President Trump stated that it would be a short war that would result in a quick regime change, the war is now in its fourth week with no signs of ending in the near future and the very unlikely outcome that there will be regime change. So let's hear what our guests have to say about the U.S. and Israeli war of aggression on Iran that is destabilizing the Middle East and disrupting global energy markets. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel coordinated an unprovoked military attack on the sovereign state of Iran without any credible evidence of an imminent threat posed by Iran. On that same day, February 28, 2026, the first day of that unprovoked war, the Israelis killed Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khameini and other senior figures, immediately transforming a long-running shadow conflict into a full regional war. Also, on the first day of the war, the United States bombed a girls' school in Manab, Iran, killing over 168 Iranian children. Iran then invoked its right to self-defense by launching missiles, drones, and proxy attacks against the United States and Israeli targets in the Persian Gulf and in Israel. However, some of their targets were civilian targets, which if done intentionally is unlawful under the laws of war, also known as international humanitarian law, which is a topic that we discuss in detail in the latest episode of the Race and Rights podcast featuring Professor Maryam Jamshidi. I recommend the audience subscribe to the podcast and listen to that episode, which was released on March 11th, 2026. Now, on March 2nd, 2026, Hezbollah entered the war by attacking Israel in retaliation for Khamenei's ruling, which led to a major Israeli air and ground escalation in Lebanon. And since then, Israel has killed at least 880 Lebanese and displaced more than 1 million people in Lebanon. On March 2nd, 2026, the Iranians effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, which cuts off the 20% of the world's supply of oil and natural gas from the global economy. So since February 28, 2026, the start of this unprovoked war, the cost of oil has increased from approximately $65 per barrel to over $100 per barrel. And finally, as of today, March 17, 2026, the estimated death toll and number injured from this unprovoked war started by Israel and the United States is as follows. More than 1,300 Iranians have been killed and more than 18,000 Iranians have been injured. More than 880 Lebanese have been killed and over 2,100 Lebanese have been injured. 13 American soldiers have been killed and 150 American soldiers have been injured. 15 Israeli soldiers and civilians have been killed and 3,300 Israelis have been injured. And at least 20 people have been killed in the Gulf countries and over 300 people have been injured in the Gulf countries. These and many other facts should be considered when examining the political and economic implications of the war on Iran.
Thank you very much, Professor Sahar Aziz, and thanks to the Center for Security, Race and Rights for this opportunity. There are many, I would say, misperceptions about this, what's happening today in Iran. And I probably would like to start by saying that unlike the conventional wisdom, I think the overwhelming majority of Iranians inside and outside the country actually go beyond this false dichotomy of supporting the war or supporting theocracy. And this is probably one misperception. Many have principled position, basically challenging theocracy and at the same time this illegal, immoral, and unethical war, imperialist war against Iran. So that's probably one very important concept, and I guess to understand the current condition today, unlike what many actually would like to suggest. With respect to the causes of the war, we also need to understand that what happened over the past few months, especially in January 2025, which many people actually were killed by state violence. So January massacre definitely somehow actually was used to sell this war. And many people out of desperation, and hopelessness actually, of course, were looking for an exit strategy and solution. And we know that Benjamin Netanyahu, on the one hand, and President Trump, they had their own agenda long before this January or even a few years ago to actually to pursue their own goal. So definitely they took advantage of this, I guess, massacre and managed to sell this war to some people. Generally speaking, I would say that there have been some arguments about this war. Basically, Iran is an imminent threat because it basically wants to, make a nuclear bomb. Iran is a major threat to the neighbors. Iran doesn't respect its own people's rights and democracy, the violation of human rights, and so many things like that. However, we know that for Israel, and particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, none of these are really the main goal for this war. Benjamin Netanyahu, at least since 1990, was basically saying that we should go after Iran as an entity, definitely, to secure its own regional hegemony. And he managed to sell this idea to President Trump twice in the middle of the negotiation, one in June 2025 and another one since February 28, 2026, that Iran is a major threat and basically you have to go after Iran. And he basically managed to sell this idea to President Trump. And President Trump actually has been the only president who actually followed this idea by Benjamin Netanyahu too. So basically, I would like to say that this war main rationale for Benjamin Netanyahu is to secure Israeli hegemony in the region. The rest is rhetoric. And of course, for President Trump is, maintaining, United States hegemony, challenging China as the major global power in the region, and definitely selling this idea to some part of the opposition. One really, really important argument here I would like to make is that basically, we know that the current authority in Iran is not democratic. However, Unfortunately, some of course, part of the Iranian opposition were after the war, supported the war in diaspora, and they tried to create an argument that Iran is an exception to the rest of the Middle East, and with this war, Iran could be liberated. Whereas when we actually analyze and understand the complexity of this region and what has happened to many neighboring countries in this region, using the argument of global war on terror, responsibility to protect, humanitarian intervention, we know that what happened to many of these nations after the war was destruction, civil war, and I guess not really democracy and development. So the argument these people actually try to make to normalize and basically moralize this imperialist invasion as a pretext to liberate Iran has many problems. So Iran's long history and civilizational depth doesn't actually make it immune to civil war or many I guess horrible consequences we see in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. Civil war and destruction doesn't come because you are culturally superior or inferior. Basically, it comes as a result of war. And definitely, sanction and so many things happen. So all I'm trying to say that this war is not going to empower Iranian civil society, is not going to bring democracy and development. And those who think that they can, bring and use this momentum and opportunity actually to liberate Iran, I think they are wrong because they are not sitting on the driver's seat. An imperialist goal, United States under Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel under Benjamin Netanyahu have their own, agenda for this war. So that's probably my introductory remarks, and I'll be more than happy to elaborate on this.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahdavi. Professor Cole, would you like to answer the question as well as expound on kind of the broader context as your introductory remarks?
Well, thanks so much, Sahar, for having me, and to CSRR. It's a great honor to be here on the podium with Professor Mahdavi and to hear his insights. I think the Israelis led the way for this war. It's not a hard sell in Washington to make war on Iran, but I think the impetus for it came from Benjamin Netanyahu. And from his point of view, I think the war was launched because Israel does have aspirations to be a regional hegemon. I don't think it's plausible because the idea of hegemony implies at least a certain amount of authority. And, there's a distinction between power and authority. I don't think that the Israeli state can ever get much authority in the Middle East, and in the sense that people would voluntarily accede to its legitimacy and its demands. But it can have power, and the United States has built it up as among the more powerful militaries in the region, and it's not afraid to express that power. It also has territorial designs on its neighbors, so it has occupied parts of Syria, has occupied more of Syria in the last 2 years. It seems to want 10% of Lebanon at least, and it wants to make sure that no opposition is voiced to these plans in regional capitals. So Iran was a real problem for the Israelis because it was a brake on these expansionist and hegemonic designs, and gave rockets and missiles and training to the Lebanese Shia in South Lebanon. It propped up for many years the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and has developed a network of guerrilla groups in Iraq, and at least has some relationship to the Houthis in Yemen. From Netanyahu's point of view, if he can take down Iran, provoke a revolution, change the regime in the way that happened in Syria, for instance, he can weaken it to the point where it's unable to stand against these Israeli aspirations to regional hegemony. And the pretext of the nuclear program is just that. The Iranians had a civilian nuclear enrichment program. It was never assessed by any major intelligence agency to have a military dimension. The Iranians were not making a bomb. The leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, the late leader, gave numerous fatwas against making, storing, or using nuclear weapons, which I think were quite sincere and frustrated some of the hardliners in Iran. But I think they did maintain that civilian nuclear enrichment capacity as a form of what is sometimes called nuclear latency, or the Japan option. If you know a country is close to being able to make a nuclear weapon, perhaps it has a deterrent effect. You won't attack it. And that didn't work in this case. There was no deterrence. In fact, it became a pretext for war. As for the United States, I think it's very difficult to analyze the thinking of this administration because President Trump is notoriously erratic and says one thing one time and one thing another. But, he says that he was given the impression by Jared Kushner and his son-in-law and Steve Witkoff, his special envoy to the region, that Iran was about to attack the United States, which is absurd because Iran didn't have the capability of attacking the United States. And he's given other pretexts for this war. Some think that he thinks that if he could take down Iran, it would, make his presidency the most glorious of the presidencies of the 21st century, and so forth. But I find it very difficult to analyze what his thinking is. Certainly, He concurs with Netanyahu that Iran should be weakened. So they're hitting Iran's launching capabilities for its missiles. They're attempting to attrite its military capabilities. And I think they originally thought that if they decapitated the government, if they got rid of Ali Khamenei, the clerical leader, that it might lead to a coup or revolution. And a new government with which they could do business more easily.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those of us who remember the post 9/11 era and the other illegal war of aggression by the United States against Iraq, but at least under the Bush administration, they attempted to provide evidence that justified their illegal war, although it was not accurate, right? The allegation that there were weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was starting or was on the verge of creating or on the verge of using. But at least they went through the motions of trying to justify it. Whereas in this war, it's Trump can't be bothered, right, with international law, and neither can Netanyahu. So in many ways, they're very much alike. So I want to then switch over to the Iranian response and the Iranian strategy. I think there's been quite a bit of analysis right now in the U.S. kind of English sources that admit, or at least that critique, the Trump administration for appearing not to have a war strategy, not to have an exit strategy, that he may in fact just be following Israel. And Israel, as Professor Mahdavi stated, I don't think hides its objective, which is to eliminate the regime, which is the last regime that is openly opposed to Israel. It was Iraq before then and Syria. And so Iran is the last regime or the last government in the Middle East that is openly opposed to Israel. But the United States, again, doesn't seem to have an objective beyond pleasing Israel or wanting to satisfy Netanyahu. So let's talk a little about Iran. Professor Cole, what do you think is Iran's strategy that it has had to develop in real time, or perhaps it's prepared for this because there was a pretty severe warning shot in June of 2025, right, when the U.S. again unilaterally bombed Iran, in this case alleging that they were there to destroy their nuclear weapons or what they believed were about imminent construction of nuclear weapons, but their nuclear program and their facilities. So what do you think Iran has been doing for the last 9 months? Did they anticipate that this war was coming? And what do you think is their strategy, or how can we understand their response since February 28, 2026? And I'll also ask Professor Mahdavi the same question once you're finished with your analysis.
So I have to say that I'm quite critical of the Iranian government's policies in this regard. My own analysis, and I'd love to hear what Professor Mahdavi thinks about this, but my own analysis is that the Iranian government has its roots in a popular revolution, in a mass movement. And the Iranian military has two divisions, two separate organizations. One is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, which developed as a guerrilla movement and fought in the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. And I think guerrilla thinking dominates this government. If you have a proper state, wouldn't you want to have an air force? I mean, they never have had very much. The revolutionary government in Iran has never had very much in the way of an air force. They have money. They had all the oil resources. They could have bought, advanced planes. And of course, the sanctions regimes does hurt them in this regard. But I think, they've been able to get around it in other ways. Or wouldn't you want a thoroughgoing anti-aircraft capability for your defenses? It is true that, Russia did a deal with them and then didn't follow through, and there have been problems. But I think that the government people thought that Iran is a very large country. Americans don't realize how large it is. It's as big as Germany, Spain, and France combined, and a population of some 92 million, larger than Germany, that they thought that it has a kind of strategic depth of its own, and that it would be able to withstand any attack from the outside. And so it simply wasn't very well prepared to fight conventionally against an attack. And so what they've decided to do, again, I think in the way of a guerrilla movement, is not to fight the United States or Israel conventionally, although they have lobbed missiles and drones at Israel to, as far as I can tell, no great effect. But they have taken their neighbors hostage. So they started attacking the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, even Oman, countries that had at least correct relations with them. We think that Dubai did a lot of money laundering for the Iranians to help them evade sanctions. Qatar has had good relations with Iran. Oman, on several occasions, put itself on the line to negotiate for Iran, but it has attacked these countries and closed the Strait of Hormuz, as it has taken the world's energy hostage. It's basically taken your and my heating bill and a gasoline bill hostage. I drive electric, but nevertheless, most people are suffering from this. That's their main strategy has been a hostage-taking strategy and an attack on near neighbors. It's been the most effective thing that they have done. Otherwise, they have suffered enormous attrition. Probably some 4,000 IRGC personnel have been killed, large numbers of popular militia, Basij, high government officials, and so forth. But they have been able to reply in this way. And it's an effective response to some extent in the sense that it puts enormous pressure on Israel and the United States to make this a short war, because every $10 increase in the price of petroleum, which is what happens when you cut off 20% of the supply, takes a tenth of a point off world GDP. So the United States was only going to grow probably 0.7 of a point this year. It could well tip the United States into a recession if this goes on. So that's my analysis of how the Iranian government has responded to this.
Thank you. Professor Mahdavi?
Yes, I think Iran's strategy, and this is what they think, I believe, this is not my position, of course, is to actually make this war of attrition, long war, and see who is going to actually survive. And the analysis is that United States in particular and Israel to some extent cannot actually tolerate this war of attrition. And as Juan said, definitely they targeted, U.S. military bases in neighboring countries, and also in addition to that, basically targeting global economy by have some control over the Strait of Hormuz, and not necessarily actually doing something extraordinary, just to make sure insurance company actually do not insurance any ships or anything. It's quite actually risky for them to put pressure on Trump, because their analysis is that this is the only language Trump can understand it. Putting pressure on that, and of course some Arab countries, Arab monarchies in the Persian Gulf can probably put pressure on Trump to do something about it. This is somehow their strategy. In addition to that, they might actually consider working with Houthis in Yemen to do the same things in a Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. And that would be another actually a strategy for Iran to put pressure on Trump and Israel to end this war. And they want, of course, end this war in a way that they do not expect another war in 3 months, 6 months later, because they want some sort of guarantees that this is not going to happen. And this is their strategy. I don't know if they can succeed or not. And many unexpected things could happen in next week or so. So these are something they can think about it. With respect to their war strategy, the armament, my analysis is that if they do not have a strong air force, it's not by choice, it's because of the sanctions. And Iran doesn't really have solid a strategic partner. Even Russia and China actually are not a strategic partner of Iran. So Iran is somehow suffering from a strategic loneliness, if you wish. Partly because of geography, geostrategic, geopolitics, and partly because of its own foreign policy in post-revolution in Iran. So it's a combination of a structure and agency at the same time. So with this in mind, the only thing they had was to develop their own missile system, which is mostly, based on their knowledge and other knowledge receiving from other countries. So at this point, we will see to what extent this can be a successful strategy for Iran, putting pressure on global economy, the only language Trump can understand, and make this war a war of attrition and see who's going to actually survive in this.
And before we move on to focusing on the diaspora, which is, I think, an important kind of stakeholder or player in this, in your professional opinions, and I realize there's a lot of uncertainty, do you think it's going to work? What do you predict in terms of given what we know as of March 7th, 2026, and given what we know about the price of oil and the pressures on Trump, and also polls are showing that this war is not very popular in the United States, especially among the Democratic voters, but even among some of the MAGA, right, the core base of Trump, because they believe that his America First political platform was, we're not the world's police force, we're not going into another endless, expensive war abroad, especially in the Middle East, similar to what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, which ultimately in Afghanistan ended up in complete failure. The Taliban are back in power, and tens of billions of dollars have been wasted, and hundreds of lives of American soldiers have been sacrificed. But also that this is not our war, right? There, you see this even among the right wing, and these are the staunchest supporters of Trump, is that why are we in this war? We understand why Israel wants to fight it, but why does the United States wants to fight it, especially now, in light of the fact that there is no imminent threat? And as we remember from June 2025, Trump's talking points after he, again, unilaterally bombed a sovereign state, Iran, was that we have set their nuclear program back years, if not decades. And so if that's true, that just lends itself to the argument that there is no imminent threat. Like, why are we spending $1 billion a day? So Professor Mahdavi, what do you think? What do you predict? And I know it's a risky question, but What do you see as the future of these two strategies?
Yeah, it's a risky, I guess, prediction. We know that unfortunately this war is very popular in Israel. Among the left, and there is nothing left of the left, of course, in Israel, but whatever, center, right-wing, extreme right, because they were successful to, I guess, manufacture this enemy, a phantom enemy, and sell it to the public. In United States, fortunately, it's not quite popular as far as we know, but I guess regrettably, Trump and this administration doesn't really care. They have their own agenda. And of course, as long as Bibi Netanyahu can convince Trump that this is going to bring some sort of easy, sweet outcome for you as someone who actually, I guess, did something that previous US president could not do it, and to become very much like a unique president, he will continue that. But at the same time, we know that President Trump can actually switch his position 180. So if he can actually make some sort of, claim some sort of symbolic victory, he probably can finish, I guess, can stop the war and put some pressure on Netanyahu. I personally, it's hard to predict. I'm not sure if this regime, if this war can bring sort of regime change. So far, what we have seen is that they replaced one Khamenei with another Khamenei, which is actually more radical, and also pushed the state towards somehow a full-fledged security state. So the state is more run by revolutionary guard and more securitized. And the civil society is weaker, the middle class is weaker. The priority is now no longer democracy, is security and order, unfortunately. People are suffering from not only economic sanction, but also the outcome of the war. And after the war, whatever happened and who claims victory, Iran is going to suffer more and more because of if not the state of a stateless and chaotic situation, but definitely, they have to rebuild this country, right? And this probably create the condition for more state repression, suppressing civil society. The idea of democracy and democratization actually become marginalized. The ordinary people suffer more economically and politically. These are the bad scenarios. Could be even worse, separatist movement, civil war, or similar condition that Iraq actually experienced after 1991, when George Bush actually asked Kurds and Shiites come out, protest against Saddam Hussein. And then when they came out, there was no support. And after that, Saddam Hussein suppressed the ordinary people, Kurds and Shiites. And then after that, you have a decade of brutal economic sanctions against Iraqi people, which was a war crime in my view, and then killing the middle class, the engine of democratization from within. And then this created a condition for another illegal war of 2023. This is probably the best scenario, one of the best scenario for Benjamin Netanyahu. He definitely doesn't really care about democracy and indigenous democratization in Iran. He simply is going after his own strategic interests. So these are really bad scenarios. But at the same time, if Iranian opposition, civil society forces can do something about their idea, they put their forces together and create a condition that can actually stop this war, putting pressure on the state, hopefully, and do something about the future of Iran would be some also scenario. We can actually think about it. Another unlikely scenario would be, which is very unlikely, that the Iranian state actually starts talking to its own people. Surrender to the people. And after that, you have a strong base to actually fight this imperialist war and war of aggression, which is probably unlikely. So many, different scenarios, but we have to wait and see what will happen, but these are probably some of the most feasible scenarios.
Thank you. Professor Cole, would you like to provide some analysis with the caveat that it's hard to predict, but maybe some of the scenarios that you think are likely or more likely or less likely based on what you know about the region and the country?
Sure. Well, there's an old saw that is attributed to Yogi Berra that prediction is very difficult, especially with regard to the future. So I've discovered, however, that if you give percentages, you can't be wrong. I would say there's a 70% likelihood that some form of this government will survive the war. And then I agree entirely with Professor Mahdavi that it will be more hardline, more securitized if it does survive. And the reason that it's not very likely that you have a government overthrow is that there are two ways to get that. One is a coup. And since they've put Mojtaba Khamenei at the head, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps have no reason to make a coup. That's their guy. And another way is a popular revolution. Iran is not a country where you can have a Syria-style revolution. Guerrillas in the countryside who gradually take over and invade the capital because of its geography. It's a country of mountains and deserts. The cities are distant from one another. It's very hard to have that kind of movement from below. The successful revolutions we've seen in the last more than a century in Iran have been largely urban, and they have involved a coalition of urban forces, including the bazaar, the merchants in the traditional market, intellectuals, students and thinkers, opinion leaders, and the clergy. And only when you've gotten three of them together have you had a big change in government. And I think, there was some chance that was starting to happen in December and January because for the first time, the bazaar was very upset with the government over the collapse of prices, and they were demonstrating the clothes they struck. There was substantial youth participation in those big demonstrations, January 8th, January 9th. The clergy are not all aboard with this government. So, but I think the Israeli and U.S. Attack on the country from the air has blunted that movement. And of course, you can't come into the streets if you're being bombed. And now, if you come into the streets, you look like an Israeli agent, which has reputational impact. And so I think that the idea of a popular revolution against the government under these conditions has become markedly less likely. And so we're probably going to get Islamic Republic 2.0, but it'll be leaner and meaner, and the opposite of what the Trump administration said that it wanted.
Well, these predictions or this analysis just, I think, confirms what many of us suspect is the case in the White House under Trump, which is he doesn't have Iran experts. Everything that he's done and his administration has done, putting aside the international legal implications, the moral implications, just from a pure, even realpolitik, geopolitical analysis, he just seems not to have anyone around him that is a country expert and regional expert, much less, which is not good for American interests in the Middle East. You certainly at least want to have experts in the room, even if you don't agree with them, but at least let them be part of the conversation. So I want to now focus on the diaspora, the Iranian diaspora, which is, there's a substantial number in the United States and also in Europe. As we know, a large number of the diaspora fled Iran in 1979 because of the harms it caused to them and their families and their wealth arising from the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Some of them left at the same time or later for political reasons or economic reasons, but one sees much evidence of anti-Iranian regime sentiments among the diaspora, and realize the diaspora is very diverse in its political positions. But there does seem to be kind of this dominant theme that the diaspora is very opposed to the current regime, and to some extent, although not all of them, do support regime change. So I'd like to unpack that. The more that we can understand kind of this complexity and diversity of the Iranian diaspora, including the diaspora monarchists, who are now supporting the return of the son of the Shah. And it's a bit of deja vu for those who know Iranian history in terms of how the CIA in 1953, I believe, the coup against the Iranian elected official, Mossadegh, and then bringing the Shah in, and even before then, and his father had been brought in by the British. So that family seems to have a history of being kind of brought in forcibly to rule by, or supported by, the great Western power of the time. So Professor Mahdavi, can you give us a little bit more understanding of the complexity of the Iranian diaspora and their role before and after February 28, 2026? And ideally also include an analysis of the diaspora monarchist support for Israel, Trump, and this joint military attack on Iran?
Sure. The fact is, Islamic Republic of Iran suffers from a massive legitimacy crisis inside Iran. It has its own social basis of 10, 15%, but the overwhelming majority of people are not happy, and they really want some sort of massive fundamental change inside the country. And the crisis of legitimacy, of course, became intensified, especially after January massacre. And the failure of the reform movement after suppressing so many social movements over the past few decades. So definitely there is a huge, huge legitimacy crisis in addition to many, many other crises. And the state, of course, betrayed so many things. I would say betrayed sacred and secular at the same time, faith and freedom. So there is a serious disentanglement toward these authorities. However, Iranian society is quite plural. It's like many other societies. It has its own religious forces, secular forces, liberal, leftists, and so many, of course, division within and among them. This is a fact. Also, when it comes to the political position, of course, definitely there are some people who support monarchy, or they simply want to see some sort of change, and they don't really see any other alternative other than Mr. Reza Pahlavi. So they instrumentally use this man, of course, to bring some sort of change. However, there are many social forces who are categorically against not only monarchy, but also against Mr. Reza Pahlavi. Progressive leftists and others are included. So Iran's diaspora is somehow representative of this diversity to some extent. So Iran's diaspora is also diverse. However, we know that pro-monarchies and pro-Mr. Reza Pahlavi have a louder voices, and they get more support from media, financial support, and of course, United States, and particularly I would say Israel, actually use them and support them to become the only voice among the diaspora. So all I'm trying to say that we should not basically homogenize neither Iranian society nor diaspora. It's quite diverse. There are, of course, pro-monarchies, and there are those who are not necessarily monarchists or pro-monarchists, but they actually see Reza Pahlavi as a transitional, person for a transitional, of course, state. But there are many others who are categorically actually oppose this, especially when they see that Mr. Reza Pahlavi actually supported this war, has close relationship with Israel and President Trump. So they are actually against both theocracy and this representation of monarchy. I would say Zan Zindagi Azadi, Women Life Freedom Movement, which was quite actually progressive and glorious sort of, movement, in many, many ways was a much better representation of Iran's dynamic, condition, and to some extent, diaspora at the time was quite actually progressive and representative of Iran's condition. After that, because of the suppression of movement, and also after June war, when a state also did not work with the civil society and also created this massacre of January massacre, more people actually became disappointed towards the state and definitely showed some sort of sympathy towards this section of the opposition. At the same time, we know that there are opposition inside Iran, but many of them are in jail or house arrest. And we don't really hear much from them. So this is really, really important to understand the dynamics and diversity of Iranian society opposition. But what I can say is that definitely people want major substantive change above and beyond this theocracy and Islamic Republic. But the future, of course, depends on so many factors in terms of how strong is the leadership of the opposition, organization, a unifying, inclusive discourse, and of course, definitely the role of the state in terms of oppression, global civil society support, and definitely global structure of power. So many, many things are definitely involved in this context. But I just repeat myself that neither Iranian society nor Iran's diaspora is homogenized and with one voice. We should definitely appreciate this diversity and plurality.
Right. Thank you. And I do want to reiterate a point you made, which is really important for our audience that isn't familiar with the diversity in the Middle East, which is just as diverse as Europe or North America or, any other part of the world, is that the media here, if you want to be cynical, you may say it's intentional. If you want to be charitable, you can say it's due to ignorance. But the effect is that the media tends to provide disproportionately more coverage to the anti-Iran perspective, right? Which doesn't do justice to this kind of complexity in terms of just listening and being able to learn from the different categories of critiques or support or somewhere in between. Professor Cole, you are a historian by trade, and so you also have, the advantage of seeing kind of the long arc of history. So where can you give us some insights into the role of the diaspora, whether it's in this current moment of war, but also before, especially at least since 1979?
Well, there wasn't much of an Iranian diaspora before 1979. There were a lot of students. There used to be a saying back in the 70s that half the world is full of water and the other half is full of Iranian students. But as for families that moved abroad and lived in large numbers in Europe and the United States, that was rare until the 1978-79 Islamic Revolution, when those families who were close to the Shah, the former government, or benefited from it, or were members of minorities who were disliked by the new Khamenei government, fled in very large numbers. I was at UCLA at the time doing my doctorate and studying Persian when the Iranians showed up, and I was living in Santa Monica, and all of a sudden we had an Iranian-American community in Santa Monica, and I hung out with the young people. That's how I learned Persian, and had a view of that diaspora community, and of course one sympathizes with them. Many of them escaped by the skin of their teeth from being executed. They took long treks through Azerbaijan and Turkey and suffered enormous hardship, or they had to go down through Zahedan to Pakistan to get out. And even at that time, it wasn't so easy to get a U.S. visa. So that many of them have an enormous animus towards this government is entirely understandable. But it's very interesting that the National Iranian American Council did opinion polling recently among a weighted sample of Iranian Americans. They found that 49% of Iranian Americans opposed the beginning of this war, 48% supported it. So they were very divided about the war, and that in the aftermath, 2/3 of them favor a quick diplomatic off-ramp rather than ongoing war. So just to speak to Professor Mahdavi's point that the community is not monochrome. It has many voices, many perspectives in it. But I think if you watched cable news in the United States, these statistics would come as a surprise, because I think the voices that want war to continue until the government is overthrown, are predominant in what's presented to the U.S. Audience. I think that diasporas can sometimes be very important in revolutionary movements, and it should not be forgotten that Lenin himself had to come back to Russia, had been in exile. They do play a role, but the monarchists, the people who are supporting Reza Pahlavi, I think are actually a minority of Iranian Americans. They're not 51%. And that's a voice that gets a lot of attention. There are reports during those big demonstrations in the middle of January that there were Iranian crowds that were chanting Reza Pahlavi's name. Can't verify this one way or another, but it wouldn't be completely out of the question. It should be remembered that the Marcoses are back in the Philippines. There was a family that became very dictatorial and was overthrown by a popular revolution, and now the son is back in power. So in politics, having a name matters. On the other hand, after the Soviet Union was formed and the Tsar's family were mostly killed, there was this persistent belief in the Russian diaspora that a young daughter had escaped Anastasia, and that somehow she would emerge and they'll put her back on the throne. And that was a fantasy. In my view, the likelihood of Reza Pahlavi becoming king of Iran is about the same as Anastasia becoming the ruler of Russia.
Well, I appreciate your candor, and unfortunately, the media seems not to understand that and continues to even kind of lend credence to this very unlikely and impractical scenario, which I think is also a disservice to its U.S. audience, who really should be learning about the context or the aspect of this issue through experts, not through pundits and propaganda. It reminds me of when the U.S. invaded Iraq and they had wanted to bring in, forgot his name, I'm blanking on it.
Ahmed Chalabi.
Yeah, Ahmed Chalabi, to come and just parachute in, and suddenly he was going to bring peace and prosperity to a country that, as Professor Mahdavi mentioned, had been sanctioned for 13 years, to the extent that humanitarian organizations were sounding the alarm of mass malnutrition of Iraqi children, right? That was caused by the U.S. imposed sanctions and obviously exploited by Saddam Hussein to further kind of deny his population the basics that they needed. But I want to, before we move to audience questions, ask about the role of Islamophobia, the role of perceptions of Muslims and Islam in the West, oftentimes very negative perceptions, in the manufacturing of consent, and whether it is at play and whether it is effective. This is something that we study a lot at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, is how Islamophobia or anti-Muslim stereotypes and racial tropes inform public opinion about foreign policy decisions. We see it quite a bit on Palestine and Gaza and Israel in terms of the way to justify one of the arguments, which was very intentional, to justify supporting Israel's what my position is it is a genocidal campaign in Gaza, was that all of the Palestinians are terrorists. They're all Muslims, which we know about 15 to 20% of Palestinians worldwide are Christian, but that they're all Hamas supporters, that they all are anti-Semites, that they all want to kill Jews, and that these Islamophobic tropes and anti-Palestinian racist tropes were very powerful in manufacturing consent in this just chronic and clearly documented human rights violations in Gaza from 2023 to 2025, and arguably still continue, but at a lesser rate. So how does that backdrop, that reality? And the same thing happened with Iraq, right? And much of this is a product of the war on terror, during the global war on terror and post-global war on terror. How can we understand the role of Islamophobia? And how does that then connect to views of Iran in particular and the Iranian people? So I'll start with Professor Cole.
Well, you were talking about Noam Chomsky's idea of manufacturing consent. It's always the case in American wars that racism is a very powerful argument for war. If you go back and look at the depictions of the Japanese in World War II as monkeys and so forth, then it becomes easier to understand how you could drop a nuclear bomb on civilian cities and wipe out tens of thousands of people, including children and housewives and so forth. The dehumanizing people is essential to war and genocide. And the Iranians have been the objects of this kind of stereotypical bigotry since the Islamic Revolution in 1978-79, because of the hostage crisis, because of Jimmy Carter's failed attempt to intervene, because of the subsequent events, the Iran-Iraq War and so forth. The Iranians became bigger-than-life supervillains in American popular culture. Saturday Night Live did a skit years ago about this very subject, about anti-Iranian bigotry in the United States. And every time something happened, they depicted a sick Indian shopkeeper who was attacked by mobs every time something happened with regard to Iran, because the Americans think because Sikhs wear turbans that they're Muslims, and so it fell over. But I thought it was a very clever skit and very insightful into the way that American bigotry works. Opinion polling showed in the 1980s and 1990s that if you ask Americans what people do you hate most, it's kind of shameful that these opinion polls are so easy to pull off. They listed them above the Russians during the Cold War. That was supposed to be America's major enemy, but they hated the Iranians more. And of course, all those old stereotypes of Muslims fighting jihad and wearing scimitars and turbans and all those things are deployed against the Iranians, even though no Iranians wear turbans or scimitars to my knowledge. So dehumanizing people, deploying stereotypes, making them a natural enemy, making them evil. You'll see American politicians talk about the Iranians as evil. So all of that makes it much easier to launch a war. And what's remarkable is that even though we've had 47 years of this kind of institutionalized bigotry against Iranians, the American people, on the whole, by and large, don't like this war, and can understand that Iran did not pose a threat to the United States, that it's an aggressive war of choice. That will, I'm sorry to say, certainly harm the lives of many Americans because of the energy cost.
Yes, and I also want to point out that while we in the United States, and I assume similarly in Canada, are rightfully sensitive, right, to anti-Semitic racial tropes, we are not sensitive at all to Islamophobic racial tropes. And so I always will recommend to people, if you don't realize how serious these racist tropes are in terms of endangering real people's lives in the United States, but also causing our country to, again, go to war and spend $1 billion and kill people abroad, in this case Iranians, is imagine if we were using anti-Semitic tropes about Jews to justify a war against Israel, right? And imagine how that would be rejected, and it should be rejected, right? And that's essentially kind of the reality that many people from the Middle East live, and people from Afghanistan, because there's the myth that all people from the Middle East and Central Asia are all Muslim, and that there's not even any ethnic differences or religious differences, but it's part of kind of the racialization process, is this creating this monolithic evil, right? Kind of genetically dangerous other. Professor Mahdavi, what are your insights or perspectives? And you're Iranian Canadian, and so I'm sure you also have maybe personally experienced it, but also seen it among Iranian diasporic experiences in the West, this Islamophobia and this vilification of Iranians within the Islamophobic kind of discursive umbrella.
Sure, yeah. I guess anti-Muslim racism and Iranophobia are two manifestations of Orientalist discourse, to use Edward Said's argument, which basically create a very, I guess, fantasy picture of Iranian, which ignores their diversity and also their agency. And I would say that one of the, I guess, arguments which is somehow related to this Orientalist discourse and Iranophobia and anti-Muslim racism is that you do not acknowledge that Iranians have their own agency to bring some changes, and they need some charity-style support from the West as a savior to save them. Whereas that's not the case. Of course, Iranians have their own agency. They don't need really a Western white savior actually to save them from their own culture or civilization, a typical of clash of civilization argument. So here, it's not a bad idea actually to read again Frantz Fanon's book of, White Mask and Black Skins, or Hamid Dabashi's Brown Skins and White Mask. So this concept of actually alienation, whiteness, which is quite actually problematic. So these are all part and parcel of this discourse of Iranophobia, ignoring, rejecting Iranian diversity, and at the same time, pluralism and agency. So it's not that Iranians are a bunch of idiots with no agency, just religious people, or a typical of, pro-theocratic regime, which they really need some saving. So this dehumanization and definitely creating a very false picture of Iranian, society and civilization is quite actually problematic. And unfortunately, some people, of course, reproduce this argument by supporting the war and ignoring people's agency and diversity. So this is quite problematic, and we need to acknowledge this.
Thank you so much. We could have an entire graduate course on this topic. I want to move to some of the audience questions, and I encourage those who haven't asked to do so. And I'll ask a few, and then I'll let you all decide if you want to answer some or all of them. So one question is regarding going back to maybe the motives of this war and the objectives. And as we know, whenever a country is oil rich, that tends to also be a potential motive. So one question is, what is the role of oil here? In addition, it's not mutually exclusive, right, with the other objectives or lack thereof that we discussed earlier in our conversation. But if we look at the Venezuela, the abduction, literally the kidnapping of the president of Venezuela by the U.S. military, and the stated purpose was also to retake, I believe that was Trump's message, is to retake Venezuelan oil because it was rightfully the United States before the socialist or the leftist government nationalized their own oil industry, God forbid. So what's the role of oil in Israel and the United States motives? in starting the war. Another question is looking at the broader impact in the region, especially in Lebanon and Syria. Would you say that the war with Iran is also a way for Israel to covertly take more territory in Lebanon and Syria and act in an even more extreme way with regard to Gaza now that the world's attention is on Iran? And does Iran have an interest to have more influence in Middle Eastern countries? So it's somewhat two questions, but it's looking at the region. So we'll start with those two. Professor Cole, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, with regard to petroleum, I don't think it played a role in Israel's calculations, but it seems to bulk large in Trump's imagination. He's spoken of attempting to take over the Kharg Island, which is a major set of Iranian oil terminals. I think Trump represents a rearguard action of big oil, of ExxonMobil and Chevron and the big international oil companies against the move to green energy to fight climate change. He's a climate change denialist. He wants to promote oil and fight electric vehicles. And this attempt on his part to do so seems to me quixotic in the sense it's not very likely to succeed, but it will do a lot of damage to the world environment on the way. And we've already seen a fall off in sales of EVs in the United States. So taking control of Venezuela's petroleum industry in the way that the United States has, stark neocolonial move. Even the attempt to claim Canada is part of this oil resurgence policy. And so I think petroleum certainly is one of the things that drove Trump's desire to overthrow the Iranian government and maybe get a government that doesn't have to be sanctioned. And so you could put more oil on the market. Because one of the things that drives the superiority of electric vehicles is that green energy, wind and solar, battery, hydro, in addition to electrified transportation, electric vehicles, is much cheaper than petroleum. And likely, ironically enough, it seems to me that Trump's war on Iran will give electric vehicles and green energy more advantages in the coming years. And I think China will do very well out of it since it's a leader in those industries. But I think that was part of what was driving Trump. And then with regard to Israel, I think people, we're just not very well informed about what's going on anymore. Our media fails us in so many ways. Does everybody know that the Israelis reimposed the blockade on Gaza? I mean, they broke the supposed terms of the ceasefire of last October that Trump trumpeted, and that they actually issued this horrible, smarmy statement that, well, there's enough food was let in that they'll be all right. I mean, they already weren't letting in enough food, and children will suffer from this, and everybody, civilians, will suffer from this move of the Israelis to reimpose the blockade. They've also taken advantage of the Iran war to pursue a more thoroughgoing policy of ethnic cleansing and annexation in the West Bank. And then under the cover of the Iran war, they launched a war on Lebanon, which ordinarily would consume headlines and be a big issue. Over 500,000 Lebanese have been displaced. 3.5 million Iranians have been displaced. When we talk about deaths, that's only one of the costs of war. People losing their homes, becoming homeless, is a big issue. So Israel is rampaging around. As a historian, I think about it as a Napoleonic strategy of big changes in the governance of an entire region directed from a particular capital. So I think the Iran war works for them in all of these ways.
Professor Mahdavi, your perspective?
Yes, I agree with Professor Cole. Oil, gas, and minerals are definitely part of Trump's, I guess, calculation. And it seems to me he's going back to the old form of colonialism, not even neo-colonialism. He's quite actually frankly talks about mercantilist capitalism, and I want this, I want that, so it's for me. So this is definitely part of their calculation. Broadly speaking, I would say we definitely need to talk about political economy of war, not only in terms of oil, gas, mineral, and resources, but also the calculation after the war, what happens, construction of things after the war. It basically is part and parcel of the construction for many, many companies. Also blocking assets as they did in Libya. I mean, these are definitely part and parcel of political economy of war. Definitely when it comes to the weapons, Israel is already starting to actually advertise how effective their weaponry is to sell more weapons. So war is definitely a good laboratory to show that how weapons actually works, and especially this new generation of war using AI and how sophisticated, quote unquote, is. So definitely dirty money is part and parcel of this political economy of war and resources, which we really need to understand the complexity of it. Just look at what happened in case of Libya, Iraq, Syria, and the rest of the world. This is definitely something. And I agree with Professor Cole that Iran definitely has been actually used to deviate the attention from genocide in Gaza and, of course, more annexion from the West Bank. And I think Netanyahu and his, coalition government are going to take advantage of this.
Well, speaking of oil, where does China fit into this? Because I've heard some reporting that China relies heavily on Venezuela and Iran, in addition to other sources, but that it tends to be one of the biggest customers of those two countries. And so to the extent that the United States can either completely stop that, which I believe it has with Venezuela, if I'm not mistaken, and certainly seeks to with Iran, is that also an oil-related analysis? And I'll just note that I read today that Trump is extremely upset with China and Europeans countries for not getting involved in this war by using their navy to secure the Strait of Hormuz. And so I thought that it was very interesting that, again, he's trying to bring in all of these people, these other countries, and they, I think, are quite intelligently refraining from that trap. But where does China fit in with the oil connection, Professor Mahdavi?
Yeah, definitely China is the biggest part of the calculation, because if United States doesn't really need oil for itself, definitely wants to have a say who is going to use Iran's oil. And definitely China is the number one so-called enemy, and they want actually to stop this cheap oil going to China to of course, to compete with the United States. So I would say definitely that's part and parcel of calculation.
Professor Cole?
I think that may be what's in their minds, but they're wrong. That is to say, Venezuela was selling something in the order of 300 or 400,000 barrels a day to China. In world terms, this is nothing. The world produces over 100 million barrels a day of petroleum. Iran is more important. On the order of 15% of Chinese petroleum imports were coming from Iran. China imports about 5 million barrels a day of petroleum. And the advantage for China of taking the Iranian petroleum is that they got it at a discount because it was essentially smuggled under sanctions. The Iranians put it on what are called ghost ships with the transponders turned off. And ship it to Malaysia or Indonesia, third countries, who then transship it to these small refineries south of Shanghai that don't have an international presence. They don't deal in dollars. They don't have bank accounts abroad, so they can't be sanctioned very easily by the Treasury Department. But because of the skullduggery involved, or the ways in which this has to be done as smuggling, the Chinese get a discount on that petroleum. But, so what? if they couldn't get a discount on Iranian petroleum, they would just increase the amount of petroleum they took from Russia. The world petroleum market is not going to fail China. Moreover, what's really important here is that now 53% of new car sales in China are electric. And the International Energy Agency predicted, I believe it was they, predicted that we could well be at peak oil in China. That is to say, from every year here on in, because of the electrification of transportation in China, they will import less oil. So they're in a position now, BYD and other Chinese electric auto companies, BYD, by the way, is the biggest in the world. It's now bigger than Tesla. They just introduced a vehicle that gets on the order of 700 or 800 miles to the charge and can be charged in as little as 6 to 9 minutes. And BYD produces these sedans for $16,000. There are some Chinese EV companies that are making automobiles for $5,000. So the technology in China is improving quickly. Their batteries are becoming less and less expensive, and so forth. So my estimation is that China will easily be able to replace whatever petroleum Trump is denying them through these actions in Venezuela and Iran. And to the extent that it can't, it will just increase its incentives for consumers to buy electric and accelerate its movement away from petroleum for transportation.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons we are not aware of all these developments is that we don't. Chinese cars aren't imported into the U.S. And so the rest of the world is quite aware because they are buying these cars and benefiting from them, while we seem to be in the kind of the darker ages of trade exclusivism, which is bipartisan on this issue. So we have come to the end of time, but before I formally end, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to make any closing remarks, anything that you'd like to say that we didn't cover in today's talk, so that our audience has a better understanding, again, of the complexities involved in this unprovoked unilateral military attack on Iran by the United States and Israeli governments. Professor Cole, would you like to start?
Well, one of the things that we had discussed earlier that didn't come up so much today is the character of the normative order of the world. After World War II, enormous attempts were made because 65 million people were slaughtered around the world, and it was a horrible thing. Economies were destroyed. The nations of the world created the United Nations and put it in the charter that you're not allowed to launch aggressive wars. You're not allowed to try to take other people's territory. The only two proper reasons for a war, casus belli, were either that you were attacked and you can always defend yourself, or that the United Nations Security Council could designate a country as a threat to world order, as they did, say, in the Gulf War with Iraq, which had illegally invaded and occupied Kuwait. But neither in the case of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, nor now in the case of this unprovoked aggressive war on Iran, were any elements of international law considered by the United States. Israel has been doing whatever it can to undermine international humanitarian law, including, all of the Geneva Convention provisions for the treatment of occupied people, for forbidding aggressive warfare, for forbidding the attack on deliberate attack on civilians, which is part of Israeli military doctrine, the Dahia doctrine, which is to destroy civilian objects and infrastructure as part of the war effort. All of these things may be nails in the coffin of the post-war order. And it should be remembered that when Britain, France, and Israel got up a war against Egypt in 1956 and attempted to occupy the Suez Canal zone again after Egypt had nationalized it, President Eisenhower threatened to ruin all of their economies if they didn't get right back out of Egypt. And he went on television and gave a speech about how these three countries were in danger of trying to undermine the basic principles of the United Nations by this aggressive war. That was a U.S. president and not a namby-pamby liberal. This was the former supreme Allied commander of the U.S. Armed Forces who defeated Hitler. He stood against an obviously unprovoked war of aggression and said so, citing the United Nations Charter. And we are so far past that now that it seems like science fiction when I say it.
Yes, it's unfortunate that is no longer even within the realm of possibility coming out of the White House, regardless of the political party. Professor Mahdavi, your closing remarks?
I just want to say that I hope this madness stops, this illegal and immoral war against Iran stops. And I would say, I just read one quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we have to actually stand up to this injustice committed against Iranian people. And Iran is a land of so many great poets, including Sadi of Shiraz, who's very famous, I would say, cosmopolitan humanism, poetry of Bani Adam Azai Yekdigerand is quite inspiring. I just read the translation that human beings are members of a whole in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. So with that, we really need, Iranians definitely have a lot in their own culture and civilization. They don't really need a foreign savior to save them. They can actually fit on their feet, and as a result of this massive cultural, structural, and discursive transformation in Iranian society towards post-Islamic society, they can definitely create their own democracy. At this time, I know it's really hard to talk about hope in the time of despair, but we really need a radical hope in the time of crisis. And I'm sure people of Iran can do it if they simply rely on themselves. Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights Podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights Podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.